Here we are in Parashot Mishpatim, Part B. We did Part A last time, and then Terumah. This takes us from Exodus chapters 21 through 27. It's a rather large chunk, but we're gonna deal with it as effectively as we may. Now, the first thing that I want to discuss with you, and I know that you'll have plenty of insights regarding this, that shouldn't be news to any of you, is this section really is the transition point when the stories of the Bible end. Not entirely. There are still some nuggets, but most people who read their Bibles, if they read it, will skip over all this stuff. This is where the fantastical stories end, and they might skip over until they get to the golden calf, and then they might skip over until they'll skip the entire book of Leviticus, skip the entire book of Numbers, except for maybe the story of Balaam and the talking donkey, and then they'll mostly skip over the book of Deuteronomy, which is weird because Deuteronomy is the most quoted book in the New Testament. It is the most quoted by Yeshua, and it's the most quoted period. I mean, you have already heard, I'm certain, that scholars believe that between direct quotes and allusions, the New Testament is almost 45% quotations or allusions to rewordings of the Old Covenant, the older covenant. So this is really critical stuff, and unfortunately, people often will begin to pass over this stuff. But I want to take just a moment to give you an overview of these sections, but then I want to talk with you briefly about why these actual instructions are so important. But if you've got to look underneath the surface, and we'll deal with that a little bit in just a moment. But first, in Exodus chapter 21, we have judgments, rules, regulations regarding servants, personal injury law, and animals. We have in 22 judgments about property, sanctification, and loving your neighbor. We have in 23 regarding the justice, Sabbaths and feasts, the messenger of Yehovah who will go with them, and the promises reiterated. We have in chapter 24 the ratification of this covenant, and a covenant meal with God on the mountain with Israel's 70 elders. And then we have chapter 25, which is called Terumah, which means a voluntary offering, where they begin to gather the materials that they'll need to construct the ark, the table of showbread, the menorah. In chapter 26, we get the plans for the tabernacle. And in chapter 27, we have the altar, the courtyard construction, and oil for the menorah. Those are the sections that we're dealing with tonight in these two combined Torah portions. Now, the first thing is these Bible stories, okay? One thing I want to point out to you is that people love the Old Testament stories, and rightly so, because they are encouraging, they are interesting, they're historical, they're just fantastic all the way around. But the problem here is that unfortunately we are want to overlook the fact, I believe, that while these stories that we have read so far are certainly fascinating, there is instruction buried in these stories. It's not all stories. There are instructions that are embedded in them, and if you care to dig a little deeper, like we have been doing for years now, looking at the stories of the Old Testament to see what's beneath the stories, to see what the Hebrew language is telling us. What are the some of the deeper levels, the remez and the sod meanings of these texts? There's tremendous wisdom there, and there's tremendous insight and guidance on deeper spiritual matters that are portrayed just through story. And so the vehicle for the instruction is story. But I would point out to you, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, but I think it can be substantiated, that these stories drive us to this point, and then the bus stops. Then he says, Now it's time to get off of the bus and walk a little bit. Stretch your legs. Get some exercise. You can't just sit in the back of the bus and let me drive you around. Okay? This is unfortunately where people need to put put their walking shoes on and look around a little bit. He has taken you to a place of spiritual enlightenment, and he's asking you to get off the bus. Unfortunately, many people are just going to sit on the bus and say, I'll get back in. When you start driving, I'll go. You're going to be stuck in the bus in the middle of the desert for many years, unfortunately. So the instructions are the point. The stories are not the point. The stories have brought you to the instructions. These instructions are critical. They are what guides. They are so... Hold that thought for just a moment. These instructions reveal the character of God. The stories certainly help to elucidate and reveal the character of God. But when he begins to give his instructions regarding what to do, how to think, how to treat each other, how to treat slaves, how to treat animals, how to treat your rulers, how to treat your wife, how to treat your daughter, how to treat your son, these are the critical instructions that reveal who he is as a God. And if we skip over them, we're saying, basically, in my estimation, God is an acquaintance. He's not a friend. And not that I don't mean to be irreverent, but that's the difference. You've got friends and you've got acquaintances. I know some about God because I've read the stories, but if you don't get involved in the instructions, that's when you have that real intimacy to begin to learn. Just one sec, Tracy. Angela, you have driven the bus off the cliff. So I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
It's cool to think about this is the way God wanted it to be, but when I think about this is the way it's going to be when he reigns 1,000 years from now, and he constrains every nation to live this way, it's like, wow, this is going to be heavy.
It is going to be heavy. It's going to be
slaves.
It's going to be quite a shock. It's going to be quite a shock for some people who think they know God, and then he says, "Welcome to my kingdom," and they're like, "This isn't what we were expecting at all. We were thinking we were going to be hanging out on clouds playing harps. This is not at all what we expected." So I think that some people, unfortunately, are going to be in for a rude awakening. Tracy?
The instruction, the Torah means instruction. The instruction leads us to God. It's the path to God. And this is confirmed in the New Testament with a sad translation, unfortunately, that Messiah is the end of the law for all who believe. That word end being telos, meaning goal. Mm-hmm. Messiah is the goal of the Torah, the goal of the instructions for all who believe.
Yeah.
The Torah is not the goal, the Messiah is, but you have to walk in this Torah to get to him.
True that. Yeah, good insight. Here's something as I was reading through these 3 chapters that encompass the beginning of the instructions. Something began to occur to me, and that is this. If you lived in a third world country where injustice, poverty, and privation are rampant, disease, famine, people slaughtering each other, you would look at these instructions and you would fantasize about what would it be like if we lived in a society where these type of instructions were in place. You would say, my gosh, I would give anything to live in a society like this. But to westernized people who have taken liberty for granted and this can seem constricting to people who have experienced freedom to such an extent that anything goes, that they have indulged themselves with so much freedom, they've been glutted on it. You know the expression, familiarity breeds contempt. They have glutted themselves, all of us have, on so much freedom that you have the freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want, to whatever degree you want. As long as there are very few restrictions, which is weird because we have so many millions of more laws in America than the Torah ever dreamt about having. And yet we are entirely lawless in regards to the Torah commandments, which is weird because that tells you something. When you look at how somebody who is from a third world country might view these Torah instructions and say, if only. And then us looking at these and saying, it's restrictive. It's restrictive because we have grown so used to excessive freedom that it's almost to the point of we've got a rebellious attitude where it's like, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. That's really, really unfortunate. And looking at the Torah is really, I think, one of the guiding principles that you'll see continuously repeated in the Torah is that it's really a matter of how to manage society, how to manage the relationships, especially between the haves and the have-nots. Those who are more economically, politically, and socially advantaged, to prevent them from taking advantage of the less fortunate, the poor, the disenfranchised. It's to protect the poor people from those who might take advantage of them. But it also is protecting the more wealthy and affluent people from themselves. It protects them from themselves. To say, if you want to be, because we know that Yeshua has told us that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. Now, the disciples were alarmed by this and said, well, that can't be right. And all things are possible with God. He was using that dramatic teaching method called hyperbole, which he frequently does, like chop off your own arm. And of course he doesn't want you to chop off your own arm. He's trying to emphasize something. But we have so much instruction regarding wealth. Wealth can be very dangerous. Well, I know some of you know that wealth can be incredibly dangerous. The root of all kinds of evil. Money is not the root of all evil. Money is a root of all kinds of evil. There's a big difference. But any kind of evil you want to find, money can be a cause of it. There are other causes. Yes, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Money is a servant, absolutely. And money, in the Hebrew mind, money is equivalent to freedom. It really is. Money can give you freedom, but it also comes with a lot of responsibilities. So the Torah is really guarding this group from that group, and guarding this group from itself, and guarding everybody from treating others beneath them in a certain way. So it's really critical to understand some of these commandments and how they actually reveal the character of God. Now, I want to show you something that somebody told me like 25 or 30 years ago, which I found quite fascinating. He said, God doesn't do what is right. What is right is defined by what God does. It's not like there's some other set of rules or some other standard. God is not following some set of rules. He's establishing rules by his own behavior. Whatever he does is right. He doesn't do what is right. It is right because he does it. Just let that sink in and think about that. What's that? It's a profound sentiment. It really is. And I think that it really helps us to identify when he begins to give us instructions that he's revealing his character.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And his character never changes.
No, it does not.
So his instructions can never change.
That's right. Absolutely. And if God is the source, and Paul says this, I don't know if I wrote this down, in him we live and move and have our being. That you can take this idea, like Paul was preaching in Athens, I think it was, where he quoted that in the book of Acts, that like Hindus or Buddhists or something think like there's some God spirit and we're all like little pieces of God. That's essentially true. I mean, if you've got the neshama of life inside of you, that is the spark of the divine. Each of us has a spark of the divine inside of us. There's no question about that. But not in a weird, woo-woo, mystical, Eastern mysticism kind of way. But here's the thing. When that spark of God is inside of you, if you want to connect with the source of that spark, then that's how you conform your will to His will. And by learning who He is and what He wants from you, that's how you align yourself with that spark of the divine. Angela, I think Lou would like to say something.
But sometimes our vision of God.
Sometimes our vision of God.
Sometimes our vision of God is like ourselves, which is not true.
Right.
God
Right.
is not like us.
God is not a man. No.
And that's something that we often forget.
Yes. Yeah, He is. Jimmy, would you just set that on the... Or you can hand it to me, buddy. God is nothing like us. Period. We are, unfortunately, just a little bit like Him. We need to become more and more like Him. Tracy?
And that we are made in His image, but that we have tried to make Him in our image instead. And you hear people say, well, my God would never do that. Well, okay, that's not...
You hear that a lot,
Yeah.
especially when a Christian of probably a little more liberal mindset, when some atheist says, well, why does God allow all this evil in the world? It's like, well, my God wouldn't do that. Well, your God did do that. You just don't know it. But unfortunately, if we don't reconnect with that source by learning who He is and connecting with that, I think it was C.S. Lewis who gave this metaphor regarding being in a darkened shed with dust motes flying around. It's pitch black in there, and there's like a hole in the roof. You can't see anything except this little tiny beam of light that's coming through this hole in the roof, and then you can see it because there's dust particles. But that's all you can see is this one little beam of light. It's not illuminating the shed. But when you get down on your back and you lay on the ground and you line your eye up with that beam of light, everything becomes light. You can see everything perfectly. That is aligning yourself with God, understanding who He is, what He does, and what He wants.
Laying down, that's good. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? C.S. Lewis was brilliant, in case you didn't know. Angela?
And He's not going to force you to do that. I heard someone saying this week, He doesn't force us to do anything.
No.
He's waiting for us. And so when people say, well, why would God allow this, this, and this? He's not forcing anybody to do it. The bad things that happen are us run amok.
Generally speaking, yes. Angela, take that to Tracy and then over here if you don't mind.
Like, that's the whole purpose of the wheat and the tares parable, because he's not forcing you to produce fruit.
Yep.
He's waiting for you to produce fruit.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
And this connects with the Thessalonians, that the restraining. I think that's all connected to, we're waiting to gather to Him, but that's not going to happen until this appointed time where He's waiting for His people, because He's long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. Yeah. So we're waiting for that time when His people will differentiate His people from the tares, because they're producing fruit and the tares are not.
Can you imagine meeting just Jesus, if He returns in a couple of 100 years and everybody's like, man, why did you make us wait 2,200 years? And He says, man, why did you make me wait 200,000 years to come back here? I was ready to come back. You guys weren't ready to receive me. That'll be a kick in the butt.
And everything started off great.
Yeah.
But He told our parents, just don't do this one thing and it'll be fine forever.
Yeah.
But it's like a birth defect, and now that it's in our genetics, it's in who we are, we can't fix it.
Yep. Yeah.
We can't fix ourselves.
No, we can't. We have to submit. We have to be humble, and we have to submit. Lou?
Well, one thing we have to remember in all this, God never forgets us.
Yes.
Yeah, He never does. No. We may think He did.
Sure.
But He doesn't.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. So you're absolutely right, and that's I'll take that, Jimmy. It's tough. It's tough to realize that perhaps we're not waiting for Him; He's waiting for us. There's a very real possibility that could be a part of the deal, and that's unfortunate when you think about it. You notice that, and I know that you've seen this twice. The people say, "We will obey and we will hear." It's backwards. You have to hear and then obey. But they say, "We will obey and we will hear." Now it's interesting because we know that this word for obey and that word for hear both mean the same thing. However, I think it's printed that way for a reason. And I think that it is my own idea that there are many of these commandments that you simply won't understand. Like why you shouldn't wear linen and wool and clothing, or why you shouldn't do this, or why you shouldn't do that. You might look at this instruction and say, that doesn't make any sense to me, and it won't until you do it. I think that's what is being indicated here, is there are many of these commandments that if you don't quite get it, if you don't quite feel it, if you don't quite understand it, if the Lord has not convicted your heart regarding it, then do it, and it will start to make sense. Because I think that your obedience comes now and understanding comes later. In fact, I think that what's being indicated here is if you will obey what I tell you to do, then I will give you ears to hear so that you can see and understand. Because He doesn't reveal His secrets to lazy people. Right. He really doesn't. David says, dig for it, but like buried treasure. Tracy?
And this is this verse that you hear quoted all the time, but this is the meaning, is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. That's a prime example. Abraham. Do you think he understood why He asked him to put his son on the altar? Probably not.
No. But
he did what He said. And that's the thing. Like, if we don't understand why He said don't eat pork or don't wear linen, and just do it, and maybe you'll understand later.
Absolutely. We have to, Carla, be willing to obey, and then He may or may not reveal why we're obeying, but we have to obey no matter what.
Well, how many things that we you see in the Word to do, and in our day we're finding out reasons why.
Yeah.
By chemistry or biology or whatever.
Sure.
And they didn't know.
No, they didn't.
We get to know.
We get to know now.
One part
Sure,
of
sure. No, that's a good insight. And unfortunately, if you choose the parts you like, and we are really, really into this buffet line, a la carte, I got to have my relationship with God based upon my preferences. I like this commandment, I don't like that one. I like this instruction because it really speaks to me, and not that one because that doesn't apply to me, or I don't like that. That's from those days. But here, unfortunately, what you do is if you say, and I hear people say this, and I don't want to say this to them because it's not nice, but when someone says to me, I'm not going to keep the Sabbath right now because the Lord just hasn't convicted me in that regard. And what that says to me is, well, then God's not your God. You're your own God because you get to decide which commandments you're going to keep and which ones you're not. You've made yourself God. Or, even worse, you've created your own God. What's what you do when you decide, I like this commandment over here, and I really like what Jesus said here, but I'm not really a fan of what Paul said over there. And Moses, there's some good stuff in there, some bad stuff. What you're doing is you're piecing together a monstrosity of a Frankenstein God that is pieced together from your own ideas, your own interpretations of Scripture, and some of the commandments that you like and others that you don't, you just throw them aside. Yes. And you have essentially created an idol. Now, I know that and this part is coming right up in one of the next Torah portions, the incident with the golden calf. Now, I know that that they made this golden calf because they sent Moses up. God took Moses up onto the mountain for 40 days. They're watching lightning bolts and the mountain's on fire. It's like, nobody can live through that. The dude's dead. We need something else to guide us, okay? We just need some type of an image. We need something to see because, we're people of our eyes. And they constructed this golden calf, and then they called out, it's a festival to Yehovah. They thought that they could mix their ideas that they inherited from Egypt with the true worship of God. And how many of them died? 3,000 died in one day. And that was a tremendous thing. And we like to say, my goodness, they just received the commandments from the Torah like less than 40 days ago. How are you reverting to idolatry within 40 days? Well, what's interesting is the same thing happened with the church. Exactly the same thing. You can look at the history of Christianity, and do you know how fast they fell away from the truth? Less than 100 years. Less than 100 years. And that's not to say that we had this great apostate beast of Satan. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they lost it. They perverted it. And we had the Catholic Church, you guys. That is a wicked, wicked institution. And it still is today. And it ruled the planet for 1,500 years. No dissent. You don't like what they have to say? They'll burn you alive. 1,500 years of apostate idolatry and wickedness that has almost nothing to do with the Torah. And the poor people are under the thumb of these wicked rulers. Were there godly people? Of course there were. Operating in the outskirts and in the shadows of this system, and probably your local parish priest who had a real heart for God and was doing the best he could. But think about how rapidly the idolatry took over. And you know what? Because the Catholic Church and the fledgling Messianic Church, just within a little short period of time, decided we need to separate ourselves from anything having to do with those nasty, evil Jews. We're going to set up our own thing. They began to build an idol. And they did. And we like to, today, Christians say, well, boy, those Muslims, they've built their own abomination, and those Mormons and those Jehovah's Witnesses, you made it possible. When you say a new prophet can come up, and he can tell us new things, and he can change what came before and modify the system, well, then you've given ground to the Muslims who say, oh, it's the same God, he just gave us a new set of instructions. Or Joseph Smith, it's the same God, he just gave us a new set of instructions. Or Ellen White, or whoever wants to come along and say, oh, it's the same God, it's the same religious, we just got a little bit of different instructions. When you change anything, you have set up an idol. And we made all of these wicked abomination sister churches of the Catholic Church, we made them. And we're responsible for them. We built our own golden calf very shortly after the Messiah went up real quick. Tracy? Angela, I apologize. Did you want to say something?
Yes, I did.
Okay, please speak.
That for the longest time, the story of the golden calf, to me, it seemed so horrible. Like they had this idolatry thing, set up an image and bow down to it. And then someone pointed out to me that they were worshiping God. They were worshiping God, but they were doing it in their own way. Yes. And that's when I was like, oh, I have done that. I have worshiped God in my own way, not the way he said to do it. I did that. I was right there with that golden calf.
That's very dangerous. Very dangerous.
And I've heard Christians, because they don't know what the Bible says, that we all worship, they just think we all worship the same God, we just call him different names. And that's because they don't know him. Because if you knew him, you would never think that. There's no way you could think that.
And there are a lot of Christians who do know their God, and they will tell you in no uncertain terms, Allah and God are not the same thing. The God of the Mormon Bible is not the same God. The Jesus of the Mormon Bible is not the same Jesus. Frankly, the Jesus of the Bible is not the same Jesus that most people think he is. So, yeah. Jerry?
Yeah, one of the things that's always struck me as odd is God's very clear where he wants to put his name, and it was Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So where did the Catholics get the idea that they could take God and move him from Jerusalem to Rome? And why did all the stupid people of the world follow him?
Because, that, Jerry, I'm glad you asked that question because there's a good answer to it.
I know why they did it because I've read it, but I mean...
You're asking a rhetorical question then. You know what? We're coming to the very first set of instructions that we get here addresses that question. And I think you'll see an interesting take on that. Who's next? Is it Mikey?
I was just going to point out, this whole conversation is talking about worshiping God in your own way instead of the way he has asked you to do this. And I think we're pretty quick to read things in 2 Thessalonians and assume that this is talking about one individual antichrist, right? But when you read verses that say things like, who opposes and exalts himself above that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. I mean, that is...
Well, when you think about the idea of you are a temple of God and you have become your own God, each one of us has a bit of Antichrist spirit built right into us.
If anyone defiles that temple, he will destroy that person.
Very, very, very good. A very good insight, yeah. Was there someone else who... Jimmy, do you want to talk? I want you to talk. I'm just trying to make sure you don't fall asleep.
Well, this kind of went, what I'm going to say is kind of before, but not only do we not follow this, we don't follow the rules that anybody else makes us. It's true.
We're rebellious.
How many of you follow the speed limit? Will Rogers used to say, if you want to see the rest of the world go by, go to the speed limit. And it's the same way if you want to be,
Yeah.
You can't be a Christian and not follow what God says.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we have this idea, and I'm sure it's been around for millennia, where people who are born in Mexico or people who are born in Spain just naturally say, "Well, I'm Catholic," because the whole nation has historically been Catholic, and so they say, "I'm Catholic." But I wouldn't recognize anyone as a Catholic unless they actually went to Mass regularly and followed the instructions of the Catholic Church. And I have known many people who claim to be Catholic in their life. And of all of them, I have only recognized 2 who were serious Catholics, where they actually went to church and they actually went to Mass and they put ashes on their forehead and they were serious about communion and whatever, the Eucharist. I've met hundreds and hundreds of Catholics, but precisely 2 who, and I can identify them by name today, and I met one of them 25 years ago, and another, because it was one of the librarian at the high school where I used to teach. I didn't really have any knowledge of Catholics, and I walked in there and was getting a book or something, and I saw the librarian, and he had a smudge on his forehead. And I said, "Hey, dude, you got something on your forehead there." He said, "It's Ash Wednesday." I said, "Awesome. You do have something on your forehead, though." I didn't get it. He was like, "It's ashes. It's Ash Wednesday." I was like, "Well, really? Where did that come from?"
Second hesitation.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. All of these religious faiths, and I don't want to, you won't ever hear me exalting Judaism. Judaism is just like every other religion. They have made up a bunch of stuff, added their own rules, taken away a bunch of other stuff, and just made it a general abomination of the whole business. I say that this little group of people, all we're trying to do is read the book and see what it says. And if there's something that's in our Christianity which was added or thrown out, then throw it out or add it back in. If there's something in Judaism that was added or thrown out, then modify your Judaism to make it work according to what the text says. Modify your Christianity to make it work according to what the text says. We don't need to throw everything out and start over. We just need to examine everything carefully and be Bereans regarding the Scriptures to say, is it true because someone told me it was true? Or did I read it in the book? In the book, Angela, would you hand the microphone to my father, please?
Just a simple comment. You know, in the Dark Ages, they didn't have the Word of God except by the Roman language.
Very true.
Latin.
Very true.
And only the priest could tell
That's
you
right.
what it meant.
And
so you have these people darkened for...
Absolutely.
1500
And unfortunately, it was quite commonplace in the Middle Ages for the local parish priest to not even understand what he was reading.
Right.
He was reading from a hymnal or a liturgy that was in Latin, and he didn't speak Latin. He didn't even know what he was saying to the people. It wasn't until, the late 1500s, it was 12... Was it 1440 when the printing press came around? Okay. So Johannes Gutenberg, but it would have taken some time for people to be able to get those Bibles translated into the vernacular language that they spoke. The Catholic Church wasn't happy about that because they lose control.
Well, look what happened right after that.
The Reformation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's a dangerous thing. This has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion, but I don't want to just talk and not actually discuss the text itself. So I'm going to move a little bit forward, and I want you to take a look. That ain't funny, Keith. I'm just kidding. I'm going to take a look at Exodus 21. I want to read the entire chapter of Exodus 21 to you. I highly encourage you to read Exodus 21, 22, and 23 at the very least, because it's full of instructions for what is righteousness and how do you love your neighbor. How do you love your wife?
If you're lazy, get the audio Bible and just listen to it as you fall asleep.
Yes. It's a fantastic thing. It's a fantastic thing. All right, you ready? Okay, here we go. These are the rulings that you are to present to them. If you purchase a Hebrew slave, he is to work 6 years, but in the 7th he is to be given his freedom without having to pay anything. If he came single, he is to leave single. If he was married when he came, his wife is to go with him when he leaves. But if his master gave him a wife and she bore him sons or daughters, then the wife and her children will belong to her master. Then he will leave by himself. Nevertheless, if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, so I don't want to go free, then his master is to bring him before God, not likely, the judges. Bring him before the judges, and there at the door or doorpost his master is to pierce his ear with an awl, and the man will be his slave for life. If a man sells his daughter as a slave, she is not to go free like the men's slaves. If her master married her, but decides she no longer pleases him, then he is to allow her to be redeemed. But he is not allowed to sell her to a foreign people because he has treated her unfairly. If he has her marry his son, then he is to treat her like a daughter. If he marries another wife, he is not to reduce her food, clothing, or conjugal rights. If he fails to provide her with these 3 things, she is to be given her freedom without having to pay anything. Whoever attacks a person and causes his death must be put to death. If it was not premeditated but an act of God, then I will designate for you a place to which he can flee. But if someone willfully kills another after deliberate planning, you are to take him even from my altar and put him to death. Whoever attacks his father or mother must be put to death. Whoever kidnaps someone must be put to death, regardless of whether he has already sold him or the person is found still in his possession. Whoever curses his father or mother must be put to death. If 2 people fight and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist and the injured party doesn't die but is confined to his bed, Then if he recovers enough to be able to walk around outside, even with a cane, the attacker will be free of liability, except to compensate him for his loss of time and take responsibility for his care until his recovery is complete. If a person beats his male or female slave with a stick so severely that he dies, he is to be punished, except that if the slave lives for a day or two, he is not to be punished, since the slave is his property. If people are fighting with each other and happen to hurt a pregnant woman so badly that her unborn child dies, then even if no other harm follows, he must be fined. He must pay the amount set by the woman's husband and confirmed by judges. But if any harm follows, then you are to give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. If a person hits his male or female slave's eye and destroys it, he must let him go free in compensation for his eye. If he knocks out his male or female slave's tooth, he must let him go free in compensation for his tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox is to be stoned and its flesh not eaten, but the owner of the ox will have no further liability. However, if the ox was in the habit of goring in the past, and the owner was warned but did not confine it so that it ended up killing a man or a woman, then the ox is to be stoned, and the owner too is to be put to death. However, a ransom may be imposed upon him, and the death penalty will be commuted if he pays the amount imposed. If the ox gores a son or a daughter, the same rule applies. If the ox gores a male or female slave, its owner must give their master 12 ounces of silver, and the ox is to be stoned to death. If someone removes the cover from a cistern or digs one and fails to cover it up and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the cistern must make good on the loss by compensating the animal's owner. But the dead animal will be his. If the person's ox hurts another so that it dies, they are to sell the live ox and divide the revenue from the sale. And they are also to divide the dead animal. But if it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring in the past and the owner did not confine it, he must pay ox for ox, but the dead animal will be his. Now, these seem like archaic pastoral issues that are not even applicable today. But I would strongly caution you to not view it that way, because it's absolutely not true. I assigned my children to read these 3 chapters, and each day one of my sons had to read one of these commandments, tell me what they thought it meant, and tell me how it applies today. And they did. If my children can do it, you can do it. It does apply. You just have to think about it for a moment. And I want us to think about and discuss just a couple of these to see, how does this apply? Okay? The first one is the Torah of servants, the instructions regarding his servants, guidelines for masters and servants. Now, the first thing that you want to make note of is that, unfortunately, when an American or a British person or someone from the West reads these instructions, they say, the Bible condones slavery? No, it does not. When we look at how slavery evolved in America, I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but it was mostly Muslims who were going to Africa and capturing, kidnapping slaves and bringing them to different lands to sell them. The Muslims were in charge of the slave trade, and they sold them wherever they could take them. Now, unfortunately, we as Americans were just as guilty because we purchased them. But notice that verse in this chapter in verse 16, that kidnapping is punishable by death. So the type of slavery that we are used to in America, that did not happen in Hebrew society. When your text says slave, it really says servant. So we're not talking about going and kidnapping women and children and turning them into slaves. They did not do that in Hebrew culture. They did, however, have actual slaves, and that was for the women and children who were remaining alive after they had defeated all of the men of another nation in battle. But even they had rights and were protected. Those instructions come a little bit later. But we don't have slavery in the Bible like we have in America. It's not the same thing. Does anyone know and would like to share briefly their understanding of what is actually being discussed here? regarding how does this servanthood and slavery thing work? Does anyone know how this comes about? Keith, okay, that's a great insight. Keith, what would you say?
I was going to say something similar. If you owe somebody and you're in debt to them, then you can give them your service to pay for the money that you owe them.
That is exactly right. That is the primary way, and we don't actually call that slavery. We call that indentured servitude. There's a big difference. And frankly, the colonists who came to America, your ancestors, were almost all indentured servants. They didn't have the money to pay the British East India Company to get passage on a ship to America. They went into debt to leave where they were in Holland and come here, or from England or France. They didn't have the money. So the masters of the ship said, well, we need servants on the other side to cut down trees and hunt beavers and plant crops and do all this stuff. If you'll work for us for a certain number of years to work off the passage and the room and board, so to speak, that's what we'll do. That is what is being discussed here, is indentured servitude. That's one method. Jerry?
I was thinking over there in England before we became a country, if somebody owed somebody a lot of money and they couldn't pay it, they would put them in debtor's prison.
Right.
And this could have been a real rich guy that wound up there. It didn't make any difference what your status in life was.
Sure.
And then somebody else that had some money could go and pay this guy's debt off.
Yep.
And now this guy's got to come and be a slave or be a servant to the guy that paid his debt for however long it takes him to work for that guy to pay off his debt. But
not in excess of...
And what?
Not in excess of...
I don't know.
6 years.
Oh, 6 years? Well,
you
was
cannot
that the way
have...
it was even in England?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about...
Over there.
You can be...
Culture, you could work for you for the rest of his life.
They don't have quite as much righteousness in the medieval England than they do here in the Torah. Tracy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I kind of want to just look at it a little bit spiritually, too, is that...
Please.
Just talking about how... they owe a debt they cannot pay, and that's what we are, servants to sin.
Yeah.
John 8, Messiah says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whoever commits sin is a servant of sin," or a slave of sin. "And the servant abides not in the house forever, but the Son abides forever. And if the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." Yeah. And we just read about how one of the ways for this female servant, which we're like the bride, is to be made free, is to be married to the Son.
Yep.
So that there's another connection there, I think, too.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful insight, and it's very good that you begin to pick up on the spiritual principles that are being discussed in each and every one of these things. Angela?
And dovetailing on what she said, you only owe that debt for 6 years, and then you're free in the 7th. Just like 6,000 years, we will work the soil. In the 7,000 year will be our rest.
Absolutely. Delightful. That's absolutely delightful. And I think, I want to say this. You notice that the Hebrew servant said, at the end of the 6 years, I love my master. And it's been better for me here in these last 6 years than it has been for me prior. I think I'll decide to become permanently attached to the master. Now, there's real vivid imagery, but I think before I go to Lou, think about this. Freedom is wonderful, but it's also very stressful. When you're responsible for everything in your life, and you're responsible for yourself, your wife, your children. If you're a business owner, you're responsible for your employees, you're responsible to your employer, you're responsible for a lot of stuff if you're your own man. And there's a lot to be said for freedom. Believe me, I love freedom. However, I know that this is a feeling that is rampant in America today, and I know some of you have felt it, and that is that the stresses of life and the responsibilities, the financial responsibilities are tremendous. And you feel like you're hanging by a thread. And you feel like, man, running after trying to keep this thing afloat, it's killing me. It's wrecking my health. I could die at any time, and then what's going to happen to my wife and children? It's stressful to be your own man. And you sometimes look at how wonderful would it be if I didn't have to worry about any of this stuff. If I was the slave of a loving and kind master who took care of all of my needs. Now that idea is horrific to Americans because we're slaves of no one. We won't even pay the stamp tax. But think about that. And you look at the spiritual wisdom that is attached here to him saying, I want to be attached to this master permanently, and he takes him to before the judges, and he makes confession twice. He says, if he says, indeed says, 2 times to the judges, I love my master and I want to be attached to him. We take him to the door and we pierce his ear. That's going to put a blood spot on the door. You might have a master who's really good and loves his servants who has his doors covered with blood marks. What does that remind you of? Blood on the door. That's the Exodus. That is a picture of redemption, and it's foreshadowing the redemption of the Messiah. I know, Lou.
Well, I think this kind of tells us how we should treat each other. And if we treat each other with respect, like it says all throughout all the Bible,
Yeah.
and love each other like Yeshua said, Jesus said. And that, so even in the South, with the slaves, the American slaves, there were slaves that were treated very good by their masters,
Indeed,
and
they
they
were.
stayed.
Yes, they did.
And there were some that were not.
Yeah.
But this says how we should treat each other.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the bottom line. The most underprivileged to the highest in society. It's teaching us how to love our neighbor as ourselves. These are the commandments for how we are to love one another. You just have to read it. You can't just read it on a surface level. You'll get nothing from this. You can read the Bible stories on a surface level and be entertained, but you can't read this on a surface level. It's not going to give you anything. You might get a nugget here and there. You got to slow down. You got to read this in multiple translations. This translation is terrible. I don't know if you noticed that, and I'm about to switch.
What is it?
That's the complete Jewish Bible.
Oh, I thought you were using scripture. When are you using scripture?
The scripture, the TS 2009, that one's okay. You know what I really have been a fan of lately, totally taking you off topic, I apologize, the John Nelson Darby translation. It's a great Bible. Tracy?
I just was wondering what the significance is. Like, there has to be significance of it. The ear being pierced. That, we're... Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall write these words on the doorposts of your gates and all that.
No, absolutely. I think that you're absolutely right. And I would say write that down and make a note of it. Also make a note to yourself regarding 1 Peter 2:18 and Ephesians 6:5 through 9. Peter spends a little bit of time dealing with some of the more spiritual aspects of this same thing we've been talking about with the Torah observance.
Speaking about the ear, he also mentioned the eye and the tooth.
Yeah.
And so those are your sensory and the way that you process the word.
Yeah.
When you chew on something and you think, this is important, I'm putting it together, but and you're praying and say, Lord, help me. This was a weird one, and then when you get it, because you've been chewing on it, it's so cool,
absolutely.
and you're like, oh wow, it comes from outside of you, and you're like, man, God's good to me.
Absolutely.
And that's so. I guess God's not going to make it so that you can't do that.
Right. Yeah, good
He's
insight.
a good master.
Good wisdom. So I think, this is clearly to me, if you take nothing from this, except this one thing, let it be this. the good and kind and gentle and loving master who will take care of your needs, that's the Messiah Yeshua, who is going to set you free from your debt and give you life and freedom and give you a wife and children and you just got to stay with him. He'll give you everything you need. If you learn nothing else, take away that one spiritual principle. And then I wanted to say...
was it Peter 2:16 and Ephesians?
That is 1 Peter 2:18 and Ephesians 6:5 through 9. Absolutely. For one of the reasons that this translation said, if he says and indeed says, I love my master and I don't want to leave, then he's going to pierce his ear. It says, take him to God. It says Elohim. Elohim can mean God and does in a lot of cases, but it also can mean judges. This is your court system. There's a lot of legal stuff here that's about how to deal with, and you've heard, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's very clearly telling us about compensating other people for injuries. It's not saying you poke out my eye and I poke out yours. If I poke out Jimmy's eye, him poking out my eye, now we're both blind. That's not helping anybody. But if it's talking about, this translation did do a good job of bringing it forth. It's like you need to pay for the loss. So that's what it means, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's not an exchange of injury for injury. That would be stupid. But the kavod and spiritual kidnapping of father and mother. Notice something. I want to briefly tell you about it, that it's talking about. You notice that it said that if you strike your father or mother, you're to be killed. If you curse father and mother, you're to be killed. And that's sandwiched around you will not kidnap someone, which is a little weird. Like, don't strike father and mother, don't kidnap somebody, don't curse father and mother. Why are they stacked up like that? That's really odd, and Angela will share with you in just a moment regarding her idea about that. But I want to take just a moment to tell you that seems rather harsh. If your child curses you, you are to kill them. If they strike you, you are to kill them. That seems really harsh, and frankly it is harsh. And I don't recommend it because you'll go to prison for the rest of your life.
But they had harsh punishment in Bible days.
They did. However, we don't have a single recorded instance in the Bible or otherwise, in the Talmud, nowhere, of any son or daughter ever being killed for disrespecting parents or striking parents. There's not a single example of it ever happening. However, should it have happened, you can imagine how ridiculous that sounds and how hard that would be to even contemplate.
We don't understand what it's actually saying.
Well, I think it's saying exactly what it's saying, but I'll tell you why. Think about this. If punishment and severe punishment is a great deterrent. There's no question about it. If you are aware that you can kill someone and then get free housing, free meals, free medical care, the gym membership, and all the pornography you can ingest, there's no real incentive for not killing someone. We see what that's done to our society. We also see that respect for authority is absolutely critical. If you don't have respect for authority, you can't respect God. And authority starts in the home with mother and father. And I don't think you need look any further than America today. I know that for most of you, and certainly for me, if you were ever pulled over by a police officer, you're practically on your knees saying, yes, sir, no, sir, whatever you need, sir. Nowadays, you get pulled over by a police officer, you got a fair to middling chance that the guy you pulled over is going to kill you because you irritated him by pulling him over. or he's going to jump out of his car and puff his chest out and scream at the police and obscenities and profanities and say, you got no control over me, you calling them names. It's happening all the time. Why do you think the police are shooting and killing people in every city? Because they have no respect for authority. There's no fear of authority in the law. There's no fear of anything. That's exactly. Now here's the problem. Could this have been taken care of by somebody's kid getting killed and other kids saying, oh my gosh, I better listen to my parents? Absolutely. Who's going to set that standard? You got me. Well, and seriously, think about this. There have been court cases where the parent can be held responsible for the delinquency of a child. So that's a Torah principle at work. You saw it. If you got an ox that gores and you've been warned, if you've got a pit bull running around and it bites somebody, you can be held responsible. If you're criminally negligent homicide, reckless endangerment. It's the Torah. But I want to say, yeah, it's really harsh to think about a parent killing their child who is just off the rails. But man, somebody's got to establish authority or we end up with what we have here. Angela, would you give the microphone to Lou for just a moment? Thank you.
Well, I know that you taught in the public schools, and so did I. And every time that I could tell if I got onto a kid, I knew if they had been disciplined at home.
Oh, yeah.
Because that kid would react.
Mm-hmm.
A kid that wasn't disciplined at home, he didn't know how to handle it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that is so important.
Absolutely.
That the discipline starts at home.
If it doesn't start at home, it's not going to start.
It's not going to start.
Yeah. You can't get that horse back into the barn.
No.
It ain't going back in. Now you're absolutely right. So now I want to have Angela just tell you briefly about this idea regarding why is this commandment about kidnapping sandwiched between these commandments regarding honoring father and mother and not striking father and mother. Angela, what do you got?
To clarify, this is not my idea. This is something that I heard. Have you heard the saying, train up a child in the way he should go?
Yeah.
Okay, go is a very key word in there. They should go. They should leave you and go and have their own lives. Have you ever seen a parent who is living through their children? They're clinging to their children. Their children have become extensions of themselves, and essentially they are holding their children against their will. The parent has kidnapped the child, and a child in that situation will strike and curse their parents. So that's a warning for the parents and the children right there, because the parents are the one that set that situation up. And if you think about it, who's going to report that their child is so bad that they need to be killed? The parent. And a parent is going to be long-suffering. You aren't going to say, oh, you disobeyed me, you die now. That is not how that one's going to work, and that's probably why we don't have any record of it happening.
No, I call that spiritual kidnapping. It's not literal kidnapping. It is you could call it today. They call it helicopter parenting. You being attached. You can't cut the umbilical cord. Attached to mom's skirts. Mom's hovering. You have to separate from your mother as a husband in order to attach to your wife. I had that problem myself. God love my mother. Many of you know my mother. She's a fine lady, but she wanted to cling, and I had to kick her. Gently, of course. No, but I really had to separate from my mother in order to attach myself to my wife. I would have had some serious trouble if I hadn't learned how to disattach from my mother, my own mother. But yeah, that's like a form of spiritual kidnapping. Tracy?
And I think that makes a lot of sense with how you see this, a pattern of people who are rebelling against these parents that were too strict because they're trying to make them conform rather than training them in the way they should go.
Yeah.
And so when they do get to go, they're going to do the opposite of what you wanted.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's, good parenting is really challenging to find these days. You don't see a lot of it. You really don't.
But you don't have much training.
No, you don't. No, you're right.
I mean, how do you like to get on an airplane and their pilot would say, well, I haven't done this before. Figure it out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to skip over this next little section here. I was just going to do another little section regarding a couple of these other commandments, but I haven't really dealt with the Torah portion Terumah regarding the tabernacle at all yet, and I apologize. But I want to get to that now. But I want to point out your attention to Exodus 23, starting in verse 25 through 27. You should make a note to yourself, because here's the overall purpose and the overall promise. It says, you are to serve Yehovah your God, and he will bless your food and water. I will take sickness away from among you. In your land, women will not miscarry or be barren, and you will live out the full span of your lives. I will send terror of me ahead of you, throwing into confusion all the people to whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs on you. You guys, God is not a liar. And I believe he's incapable of lying. And I believe him when he said, you are to serve me, and I will bless your food and your water, and I will take sickness away from you. Gosh, we are a bunch of sick people. Sickness is running rampant through the Christian community, through the Jewish community, through the whole world. And I want to tell you, it's not too late. We can pray for each other all we want, but you know what? If there's disobedience in your life, that can cause sickness. And I know that some of you are more spiritual and you're saying, preach it, brother. And other of you are a little more, circumspect, and you're saying, oh, you're getting into some weird hocus pocus spiritualism here. I'm not. I can promise you that obedience, the Proverbs tell us that the word is healing to the bones and health to the navel. His word will heal you. But you have to do it. If you're disobedient and you have sin in your life and you can't, and you refuse to overcome it, or you don't feel like it, or you just don't want to push back that hard, you could be missing out on some tremendous blessings or bringing tremendous curses on yourself from not being obedient. And unfortunately, it's kind of like alcoholism. There's no cure. There's no pill you can take. You can't pray your way to obedience. Don't hear me say to you that you shouldn't pray. There's one scripture that I'm aware of, and I repeat it to myself all the time. Grant me a willing heart. Yes, I know that, but that's the only one that I'm aware of, where God says, I'll come along and help you. Because you know what? Every drunk I ever have known has said, well, there just came a point where I hit the bottom of the barrel, and I changed my mind. You did. There's no pill. There's no number of speeches you have to hear. You can call out to God all you want. You're going to continue to be a drunk until you decide to stop drinking. Period. That's tough. Nobody wants to hear that, because we feel like if all I have to do is pray to Jesus and he'll do everything. He won't. He will not. Who's raising their hand? It's Tracy.
Big surprise. I was just going to speak from personal experience, is that whenever, it's more than just obedience, but abiding in the Word and daily bread, getting that Word in you and allowing it to cleanse you and inform you, because whenever I am not doing that, even if I think I'm working on a study and I always do something in the morning for God, but it may not be that personal time where I'm eating it and getting it in me.
Yes.
And when I'm not doing that, those are the times when the things start creeping in for me.
I
and the
agree.
more diligent I am about doing that, it's like, oh, my fears are gone now. Oh, I feel good. And it's like you don't even know it. That's just what's happening.
I totally agree with you 100% there, and I would not come against what you're saying at all. But I think, unfortunately, that some people, in Judaism, in order to have a relationship with God and follow the rules of religion, it's like you got to do 100,000 things. In Christianity, we said we're throwing all of that out, and we've got 2 things, well, maybe 3 or 4. You've got to pray, and you've got to read your Bible. And you should really witness to people. Those are the only 3 rules that we really retained in Christianity. And they're not even really in the Bible, necessarily. You should read your Bible? Absolutely, you should read your Bible. But unfortunately, many people, will read their Bible, and they're filling up their minds, but it's not getting past their neck.
Well, let me clarify what I'm saying.
No, and I'm saying, please don't feel like you need to defend yourself, because I'm not saying
heart.
What?
Otherwise, you're just reading it. You have to have that willing heart that says, show me how to do this work.
Show me how to do it. You're reading it for a purpose of figuring out what do I need to do. Because unfortunately, there's so many people, they're all in the university systems teaching divinity courses. They're way smarter than you and me at the Bible knowledge, but they don't do a lick of it. Yeah. Gracie?
You also have to have the attitude of not show me what you want me to do and I'll decide.
Yeah.
It's going to the Lord. I want your will because I want to be where you want me to be.
Right.
And it's the attitude of going, you don't walk into the throne room of the Queen of England and say, hey, how are you today?
Right.
There is protocol.
Sure. Absolutely.
There is a way to bow. There's all this to this person. And yet we forget to give God the same honor of how we approach him in his room.
Good insight. Speak nice and loud, Lou.
Okay. Well,
that's not a problem for you.
I know it's not.
Well, I have a son that was in prison. And one time I was visiting him, and he, sometimes when they get in prison, they all of a sudden turn and read the Bible.
Sure. You got nothing else to do.
But I asked him, I said, well, now, if you had done what that Bible told you to do, would you be here today? Did you know what he said? No.
Yeah.
And that's true. If we lived by the Bible.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's all I'm saying.
No, that's a keen insight. I'm just going to show you a couple things regarding the tabernacle, and we're going to call it an evening. Angela, you wanted to... Oh, about the tabernacle? Okay. In just one sec. I want to just make a brief statement. More of your Bible text is devoted to the tabernacle, the temple, the ark, the furnishings. There's more written about this in your Bible than anything else. It takes up more space than any other subject. New Testament, Old, doesn't matter. This is huge, but it's also incredibly mysterious. This is some of the mysterious stuff that it's not about this golden box. It's way, way beyond that. It's not about this bronze laver filled with water. It's way, way beyond that. This is very mundane and simple stuff on the surface, but there's a lot of it, a ton of it. And we're going to get into it because it's going to continue in our Torah portions. I'm not going to have a lot of time to deal with it this evening, but I do want to make you aware, if you want to be seriously spiritually blessed to understand yourself, mind, will, and emotions, if you want to understand community and coming together as a community, if you want to understand holiness, if you want to understand getting closer to God, it's all buried in the details of this, and it takes up more space in your Bible than any other subject. But it's hard to wade through. It's hard to wade through. Okay, Alfred Edersheim has some fantastic stuff regarding the temple. He's a Jewish Christian from Germany. This is something that I want you to consider We got a bronze altar where the animal sacrifice is taking place. We've got a giant wash basin where you're supposed to wash your hands. You've got the menorah on the left, light on the left. I always remember it that way, light on the left. You've got the table of showbread where there are literally 12 pieces of bread that are shaped like faces that represent the 12 tribes on a golden table. You've got the altar of incense, and then you have the Ark of the Covenant. Each one of these things is spiritually representative of something critical. And I want you to consider what are these things a picture of? And what would it be like if one of them was gone? Something critical is going to happen to your body, to the body of the believing community if one of these elements is gone. Even the outside curtain is representative of something. It's thin. If you got a good run, you could plow right through it. What does that represent? Your physical body. Okay? What does the bronze altar of sacrifice represent? What does this water of cleansing represent? Each of these represents something critical, and I just want you to consider what those might be and what would happen if one of them were missing. It's fascinating. Okay, now secondly, here is the only actual depiction of the menorah from the actual temple that was built by these Israelites. This is inscribed, chiseled in stone on the Arch of Titus in Rome, because Titus is the one who sacked the temple. Those are an engraving on the Arch of Titus showing the Roman soldiers carrying away that menorah. Now the Jews have rebuilt the menorah, and it is now encased in bulletproof glass somewhere near the Temple Mount, and that is made out of solid gold. It's got some serious security measures, but notice that there's some differences here. And if you read the description, it talks about knots and flowers. Knots and flowers. The knots and the flowers are on the stem on this one, but on the original, the knots and the flowers, knots and bowls are on the branches themselves. That's a little bit different, and I'm telling you that each one of these knots and bowls means something on that thing. It's fascinating stuff. The Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is what we look at as traditional, and I want to show you this just because I think it's so fascinating. This is traditionally what you would see with the Raiders of the Lost Ark type stuff, I personally don't think it's anything like that. Nobody knows for certain, but I heard someone say this. It may have been Michael Root or someone else. I don't know. But you got to remember that this is a throne. This is a throne. You can't sit on that. That's not going to be comfortable. But if you've got an angel, the box like this, and you got one angel reaching out his wing like this, and another reaching out his wing like this, and another angel on the other side reaching out like that, you've got a throne. You've got a throne. It's not two angels covering over like this. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a throne. I don't think it looks like that. And there's another thing. You can see, if you Google the word Ark of the Covenant, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of images like this. It's entirely wrong. Not only because the angels are wrong, I think, but there's one thing that's a dead giveaway, and that you can tell it was made by a Gentile and not a Jew. The poles are going the wrong way. The poles do not run parallel to the length of the ark. They run this way. Because if you've got the poles running, if the box is here and you got the poles running this way, you pick it up on your shoulders. You got one guy there and one guy here, one guy there, one guy there. Then the king sitting on the chair is facing forward. If you're carrying it like that, is he riding side saddle? You're walking with the box sideways and the king is facing that way. That's not how it works. So in actual physical representation of it correct, that is the only illustration I could find on the Google search engine that showed the box the correct way, with the poles going the right direction. Because if you had a guy carrying that on his shoulder and another guy right there, they're kicking each other. You can't walk with a guy. It's literally 1.5 a cubit. A cubit is from your elbow to your fingertips. That's how. There's 1.5 of those. That's how big that box is. You can't carry that on your shoulders with a guy 1.5 cubits in front of you. You're kicking each other's feet. But if you turn the poles the other direction, and you put this on a guy's left shoulder and this guy's left shoulder, right shoulder, then you're walking with that box facing forward. The king is sitting in, you know what I'm saying? So it makes so much more sense. And then you've got the high priest's garments, the garments of the high priest. He's got this turban, he's got the gold band that says Holy to Yehovah imprinted upon it. He's got an undergarment underneath there that goes from the waist to the mid-thigh. And then he's got this white garment. And then he's got this overcoat with tassels and pomegranates and bells that literally make a jingling sound. You've got the ephod, which is actually attached to these cords that hang over the shoulder. You've got these 2 onyx stones with 6 of the tribes written on each one. You've got this breastplate that is not, it's on the ephod. They're 2 separate things. You got a little pouch somewhere in there that contains the Urim and the Thummim, which is a terribly mysterious thing. We have no idea what that is or how it works. But there's great significance to each one of these elements. Absolutely.
Not Roman armor.
No, absolutely. Angela, do you want to say something for just a moment? Because I'm wrapping up here.
Yeah, just a little nugget about some of the stuff in that section. Hopefully to get you interested and watch and get you to actually read about the temple, because I skip it. And then, and other people have done the heavy lifting on this. So this is like a compilation of other things that I've put together that someone else did the work here. But there's 2 things in there. There's a section that talks about the boards, and there's a section that talks about the curtains. And I'm going to talk about those just for a couple minutes. Do you remember when he started tonight, he said about these stories in Genesis that there's stuff embedded in there. They're not just stories. There's stuff in there. And then Jimmy said something about our birth defect, and it's in our genes, right? This problem that we have. Okay. And then Alan said something about searching for treasure. So I wanted to show you just a couple little nuggets in this section, and you can look into this further. We also did a teaching on it. If you want a link to that, just email Alan. Okay, so in this section on the boards, there's 46 boards that make up the tabernacle. You have a building, you have the roof, and then you have the courtyard. So I'm just talking about the building. There's 46 boards. There's actually 48, but only 46 are visible from the inside. 2 of them are outside. So 46 boards visible from the inside. And then if you add up, there's another section in this Torah portion where it talks about the curtains that cover it. And some of them are like 4 of them sewn together or 11 sewn together. If you add up all the curtains that are all attached and sewn together, I know there's 4 layers, but if you add up all the way it's made, the way it describes it, there's 23 curtains covering this. So those are interesting numbers, 46 and 23. Hold on just a second. In Genesis, there's a story about when after Jacob discovers Joseph's alive and they all go down to Egypt, okay, before the Exodus, and it lists everybody who goes down there. And there's some number wrangling. Here's some things you have to do research on and understand. But essentially, you have Rachel and Leah. If you add up all their descendants that went down, you have 46. If you add up all the ones that are listed for the handmaids, how many do you think you have? 23. So there's something about this 46 and this 23 number. And And then in that section of Genesis, he says, out of Egypt I called my firstborn. There's something about birth, genetics going on here. Now, how many chromosomes do each of us have?
46.
46. Okay? When you make a baby, you get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. Yeshua had 23 from his mom. Where did the others come from? His Father in heaven. Okay, so then if you look back at the tabernacle, you have 46 boards covered by the 23. And when you have that structure of 46 covered by the 23, Yeshua, what happened to the tabernacle? The Shekinah glory was able to indwell it. Yeah. So you kind of see how that works with us.
Conception?
What?
Spiritual conception.
Yes,
Spiritual
conception. And restores our connection to the heavenly.
Thank you.
And that's just a tiny, teeny little thing that's in there. And this takes up more of the Bible than any other subject. So if you
I got one thing.
care to really...
You can give that to Carla. I'll stand by Jimmy.
The one error that you always see in the depictions of the ark is the angels' wings don't really touch, and they're supposed to touch. And I think that's showing that there's the first coming of the Lord as the angel of the Lord, and then there's going to be that second one. And so they're really the same person. They're made out of one piece of metal. You can't glob a bunch of pieces together. You had to hammer it out of one piece.
Yeah.
And so there's the two angels that are actually one, but they sure do seem to be two,
Yeah.
but they're not really two.
That's a good insight. Good insight. Carla?
Just another thing to take some time to study in the section about the tabernacle is the metals and the way it was laid out to come together. It actually creates an electromagnetic field.
I have heard that.
And there's a frequency in that. And what all that means, and again, it's a spiritual...
440 hertz.
So, just a note, you know.
That's fascinating. You can hand that to Tracy. No, it's all wonderful and fascinating things, and I thank you for indulging us with your patience this evening. I know it was a little bit longer. We have food for you. Thank you for your time and attention. Next time we'll be studying Tetzaveh to chapter 30 in Exodus. Let us pray.